Chapter 17. The shelter was damp, and despite the many extras Mr. Williams had installed, the place still smelt unpleasant. Barbara hesitated on the second step, unwilling to descend into the darkness. "Clarissa, have you got your torch? I don't want to go any further in case I fall." "No, damn it, it's on the kitchen table. Move against the wall and I'll go past you. I'm pretty sure I can find the matches and light a candle." "That's going to be tricky. I'm the size of a barrage balloon, and this is a very narrow space." The situation was ludicrous, and an unexpected bubble of laughter escaped. There's a very rude song about old ladies locked in the lavatory. For some reason, I have a sudden urge to sing it. She flattened herself against the wall, and Clarissa's hands reached to feel her bulk. "This is going to be harder than I thought. Perhaps it would be easier if you sat down, and then I can step around you." "Good idea. Hang on a minute, I'll slide down the wall." By the time her bottom touched the concrete step, they were both giggling. "Okay, I'm down. I'll squash myself on the left. You try and squeeze past on the other side." Clarissa bent down and gripped Barbara's right shoulder and then carefully eased past. "Good show. I'll have a light on in a minute. Don't try and move until we can see." A few moments later, the flicker of a match glowed in the suffocating darkness. "Almost done. Just got to find the bloody candles." Soon the interior was lit by a flickering flame in an upturned flower pot. Barbara pushed herself upright and edged down the final steps. It's a good thing we're not down here in the middle of winter. It would be freezing, especially as we now know we can't use the paraffin stove because of the fumes. "Take a pew, Barbara. I'll find the tilly lamp and get it going, and then we can get ourselves organised." Clarissa had to shout because of the noise of the plane outside. As she turned to walk to the far end of the shelter, there was a hideous whistling sound. A deafening explosion shook the walls, and the candle went out. Barbara instinctively crouched down, putting her head between her knees in the hope she might protect her precious burden. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see, the noise so loud it hurt her ears. What was happening? What was that terrifying noise? She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she wasn't sure existed that her baby would survive. The appalling din could only be falling masonry. Radcliffe Hall must have taken a direct hit, and the building was collapsing on top of the shelter. The air was thick with the dust that fell from the ceiling and walls. It was difficult to breathe. The clattering continued, but she was sure the noise was less than before. She didn't dare get up, didn't want to move at all until everything was quiet. An eternity later, the noise had all but stopped. Just the occasional bump of falling masonry accompanied by the groans and creaks. Thank God there were no gas or sewage pipes to flood the shelter with poisonous fumes. Slowly, she pushed herself upright, shaking off the debris from her lap before calling out to her friend. Her first attempt failed. Her voice was too weak to be heard. She tried again. "Clarissa, are you all right? I'm okay, but I'm surrounded by God knows what and don't dare to move." There was a faint groan, and then an equally feeble voice replied, "I'm fine, I think, but it's difficult for me to breathe in all this dust." "I think it will settle onto the floor if we leave it a bit longer. Try covering your mouth with your skirt. That's what I'm going to do. Don't try and talk for a bit." "We're trapped down here, Barbara. It sounded as if the house fell on top of the shelter." Clarissa coughed and wheezed before continuing. "It's going to be ages before anyone can take us out." "It doesn't matter how long it takes. Once things settle, we'll get organised. Thank goodness your father put water and food down here." Talking was painful. "Try and sleep. Let's keep quiet until the air's clearer." She dragged the front of her smock over her head and leant against the wall. The baby shifted inside her, and some of her tension released. He was fine. He wouldn't be affected by the choking air. As long as she breathed, so would he. The minutes dragged by. The air was marginally better, and there were no more sounds from above. She tore the cloth from her face. Before the bomb dropped, they'd been able to hear the outside world. Now there was an ominous silence. It could mean only one thing. They were buried under the rubble, completely cut off. They wouldn't hear when their rescuers arrived, but far worse, those who were coming to save them wouldn't know they were alive. Would they abandon the search after a couple of days, leaving them trapped? Clarissa's heavy breathing must mean her friend had taken her advice and gone to sleep. She squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again several times, hoping this might improve her vision. But it remained inky black. She needed to pee. If she used the wall to balance, she might be able to inch her way to the steps. Once there, it should be relatively simple to find the curtain concealing the portable lavatory. Standing up was nerve-wracking. She was unsure if the roof had caved in and she might crack her head open. She was reluctant to lift her arms above her head to check, as Mrs. Hughes had told her doing this might put the cord around the baby's neck and strangle him. The atmosphere was cleaner at head height, and the dust was beginning to settle, which was a good thing. She took several deep breaths, sneezed a couple of times, but otherwise suffered no ill effects. Keeping her right hand touching the wall, twice she cracked her knees on fallen objects, but she was fairly sure these were just bits of furniture and not bits from the ceiling. Eventually, her fingers touched material. She was there. She was bursting and hoped the Elson hadn't toppled over in the blast. If it had, she was going to use the alcove anyway. She edged around the corner, behind the curtain, and kicked forward. Her toe clanked against a metal container. In the small space, she could move more easily. She lifted the wooden lid, unpinned her knickers, and sat with a sigh of relief. At least they could maintain their dignity until they were rescued, which was something to be grateful for. Having emptied her bladder, she felt much better and was ready to grope her way to the rear of the shelter and try and find the dropped matches and candle. How long had they been trapped down here? She wasn't hungry, so didn't think it could be more than an hour or so. Perhaps it was around midday. She waited at the steps to get her bearings. Joe and Grandpa would be above ground somewhere. They'd been due to arrive about now. Would there be ARP wardens, policemen and fire officers on the scene already? She kept her eyes closed and tried to visualize the interior of the shelter. She'd only been down here briefly, but was almost certain it would be about 8 or 9 steps to the end where the larder and other bits and pieces were stored. If she was quiet, she might be able to find the Tilly lamp and get it going before Clarissa woke up. They couldn't have a hot drink, but there was plenty of water and more than enough to eat for several days. Cold sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, and a wave of panic almost overwhelmed her. The walls began to close in, and she wanted to scream, to kick and hammer on the walls, begging for someone to let her out. She pushed her fear aside. She wouldn't give in to claustrophobia. If they were to get through this, then she needed to remain calm. Her breathing slowed, and she was ready to move forward again. She wasn't sure where Clarissa was sitting, but she was moving so slowly that even if she did bump into her, it wouldn't be a problem. Counting the steps in her head helped her to keep focused. With the fingers of her left hand trailing against the wall and her right hand extended in front of her, she headed to the far end of the shelter. She reached it more quickly than she'd anticipated, and the shock of her hand meeting a solid object made her squeal. "Is that you, Barbara? What have you done? Are you hurt?" "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. I bumped into the dresser. I'm going to find some matches and a candle or two. You'll be pleased to know the loo is fully functional, thank goodness." "I need to go, but I'll wait and see if you can find me a candle first. You'll never find the one I lit or the matches, not in the darkness. I'm certain the candles are in the left-hand one." After a great deal of rummaging and muttering, Barbara located both. Looking after Silver had given her plenty of practice at doing things in the dark, and soon the shelter was bathed in a flickering golden light. Clarissa didn't react to this triumph, and Barbara turned to speak to her. She almost plunged the shelter back into darkness. Her friend had slumped against the wall, her face ashen, and her breathing suddenly sounded laboured. "Do you have your tablets? You need to take your medicine immediately, Clarissa." Her friend was unable to speak, but indicated she wanted to be helped upright. Barbara braced one knee against the edge of the narrow bed and grabbed Clarissa's hands. Pulling an almost dead weight upright was difficult. She was sure someone as huge as her shouldn't be doing it, but had no choice. "Put your arm around my shoulder